With his trademark strut and explosive shouting, actor Sherman Hemsley turned the character George Jefferson into American television's ultimate symbol of the authoritative, straight black patriarch. But he was actually a gay man trapped in a corporate cage. As the AIDS epidemic slaughtered his peers, network bosses exploited his terror of being outed. They forced him to spit homophobic jokes on camera to protect their ad revenue, then fired him without a single phone call. The second ratings dropped. After sacrificing his true identity to make CBS billions, his reward was merciless. His body was abandoned in a morgue freezer for 109 days, held hostage in a legal fight over his last few pennies. Join us as we uncover the dark truth of a man who had to fake his entire life to survive. He was born on February 1st, 1938 in South Philadelphia. Hemsley was raised by a single mother, Arsenia. Her life was defined by grueling physical labor. She worked long, taxing hours in a local lamp manufacturing plant. The work was repetitive, dangerous, and paid wages that barely kept them above the poverty line. Arsenia was the sole provider, a reality that forced young Sherman to understand the direct correlation between relentless labor and basic survival very early on. Compounding the economic hardship was a profound absence within the home. Hemsley grew up completely unaware of his father's identity. In an era where the nuclear family was aggressively promoted as the baseline of American morality, growing up fatherless in a working-class neighborhood carried a heavy social stigma. He navigated his entire childhood and early adolescence with this void. It wasn't until he turned 14 years old that he finally met his father, a man named William. The psychological impact of navigating his formative years without a male role model, only to have one introduced during his teenage years, forced Hemsley to construct his own definitions of manhood and self-reliance from the fragments of the neighborhood around him. The streets of South Philadelphia offered their own brutal education. To survive in that environment, a young man had to project an exterior of absolute toughness. Any display of softness or deviation from the rigid neighborhood norms of masculinity made you a target. Seeking protection and a sense of belonging, Hemsley drifted into the local gang culture, specifically joining a group known as the 20th Street Gang. This was not an organized crime syndicate. It was a street-level survival mechanism. However, the consequences of this life were entirely real and frequently fatal. Hemsley witnessed the immediate violent outcomes of street life. He watched peers fall victim to neighborhood violence while others were swept into the penal system. He recognized a statistical certainty. Remaining on 20th Street would end in early death or incarceration. He made a cold, calculated decision to extract himself from the environment, recognizing that the local public school system was not providing a viable exit strategy. Hemsley dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. He needed structure, discipline, and, most importantly, physical distance from South Philadelphia. He found it in the United States Air Force. Enlisting in the USAF during the 1950s provided Hemsley with a rigid, controlled environment. The military demanded conformity and absolute adherence to the chain of command. For 4 years, he served his country, operating within a system that stripped away individuality in favor of collective duty. The military gave him a steady paycheck, removed him from the dangers of the 20th Street Gang, and provided the distance he needed to recalibrate his life. It was a crucial transitional period, but the military was not a place where a deeply artistic and profoundly private man could thrive long term. Upon receiving an honorable discharge, Hemsley returned to civilian life with a pragmatic approach to his future. He needed stability. He secured a position with the United States Postal Service working as a mail sorter. In the mid-20th century, a job with the USPS was a highly coveted position within the black community. It offered a steady government salary, solid benefits, a pension, and a level of respectability that was difficult to achieve in the private sector due to pervasive systemic racism. By day, Hemsley was a diligent, invisible government employee. He stood on the sorting floor, processing thousands of letters, blending perfectly into the machinery of the American workforce. He was doing exactly what society expected of him, securing a safe, respectable living. But by night, he was systematically dismantling that very same routine. While working at the post office, Hemsley enrolled at the Philadelphia Academy of Dramatic Arts. This was the true turning point of his life. Acting was not merely a hobby to escape the monotony of sorting mail. It was a psychological necessity. For a man who had spent his life projecting toughness on the streets of Philadelphia, conforming to military discipline, and hiding his true nature from a society openly hostile to homosexuality, the stage offered something unprecedented, a safe space to inhabit different identities. Acting allowed him to express a full spectrum of emotions, to be loud, angry, vulnerable, or eccentric, all while protected by the armor of a character. If he was judged on stage, they were judging the role, not Sherman Hemsley. This dual existence, the respectable postman by day and the aspiring actor by night, perfectly mirrored the broader sociological concept known as the politics of respectability. This concept was a dominant survival strategy within the black community during the 20th century. It dictated that in order to counter the pervasive negative and racist stereotypes weaponized by the white majority, black Americans had to present a flawless, unimpeachable public image. This meant adhering strictly to conservative values, traditional family structures, and rigid gender norms. Excellence was required just to be treated with basic equality. Within this framework, there was absolutely zero tolerance for any deviation regarding sexuality. To be gay was viewed not just as a personal failing by the conservative institutions of the time, but as a direct threat to the collective progress of the entire community. It gave the oppressive majority another reason to marginalize them. Hemsley absorbed this reality entirely. He understood that his survival, both professional and social, depended on his ability to compartmentalize his authentic self. He became a master of compartmentalization, executing a flawless public performance while completely walling off his true identity. His dedication at the Academy of Dramatic Arts eventually demanded a larger arena. Recognizing that Philadelphia could only take him so far, he made the gamble to leave the security of the USPS and relocate to New York City. He integrated himself into the theater scene, eventually joining the prestigious Negro Ensemble Company. This institution was a vital incubator for black theatrical talent, providing rigorous training and opportunities to perform narratives that centered on the black experience rather than peripheral stereotypes. Hemsley honed his craft, moving from small uncredited television background roles to legitimate stage work. His breakthrough arrived when he secured the role of Gitlow in the Broadway musical Pearlie. The production was a critical and commercial success, and Hemsley's performance was electric. He demonstrated an innate, razor-sharp comedic timing that could command a room. He knew exactly how to use his small physical stature to his advantage, generating massive, explosive energy that captivated audiences. It was during this Broadway run that destiny, in the form of a television producer, intervened. Norman Lear was rapidly becoming the most powerful man in American television. With the launch of All in the Family in 1971, Lear had shattered the sanitized, heavily censored mold of the American sitcom. He brought racism, bigotry, class warfare, and political division directly into the living rooms of millions of Americans through the character of Archie Bunker. Lear was constantly searching for actors who could deliver heavy, controversial material with precise comedic execution. Lear attended a performance of Pearlie and saw Hemsley on stage. He did not see Gitlow. He saw the perfect foil for Archie Bunker. Lear was developing a black family to move into Archie's neighborhood in Queens, the Jeffersons. He needed a patriarch who could match Archie Bunker's abrasive bigotry step for step, a man who was just as loud, just as prejudiced, and just as unyielding. Lear decided instantly that Sherman Hemsley was the only man on earth who could play George Jefferson. There was only one problem. Hemsley was firmly under contract with Pearlie and refused to break his commitment to the stage production. In an industry defined by impatience and immediate recastings, Norman Lear made an unprecedented decision. He wanted Hemsley so badly that he chose to wait. For 2 entire years, Lear introduced the Jefferson family on All in the Family without their patriarch. He hired actor Mel Stewart to play George's brother, Henry Jefferson, acting as a temporary placeholder to spar with Archie Bunker. Lear kept the door wide open, essentially holding a massive television career in escrow until Hemsley finished his run on Broadway. When Hemsley finally arrived on the set of All in the Family in 1973, he stepped into a cultural phenomenon. He was 35 years old. The rough education of South Philadelphia, the discipline of the Air Force, the routine of the post office, and years of grueling theatrical training had all led to this exact moment. He walked onto the soundstage, assumed the aggressive posture of George Jefferson, and changed television history. But as the cameras began to roll, cementing his face into the minds of tens of millions of Americans every week, the trap was simultaneously being set. The very role that was about to grant him immense wealth and historical immortality was also the mechanism that would demand the total and permanent suppression of who he truly was. The machinery of Hollywood had found its perfect patriarch, and they had no intention of letting him be anything else. When Sherman Hemsley walked onto the CBS soundstage in 1973 to officially debut as George Jefferson on All in the Family, he was not just stepping into a television role. He was stepping into a highly calibrated, heavily guarded corporate machine. The television landscape of the 1970s was undergoing a tectonic shift. For decades, black representation on American television had been largely confined to subservient roles or sanitized, non-threatening caricatures. Norman Lear's productions were actively dismantling that framework, but they were doing so within the strict, profit-driven parameters of network television. To sell the concept of a fiercely independent, wealthy, and unapologetically black entrepreneur to a predominantly white mainstream American audience, the network required a specific type of armor. George Jefferson was allowed to be rich, and he was allowed to be arrogant, but to remain palatable to the masses, he had to be boxed into a rigid, almost cartoonish archetype of hypermasculinity and traditional heterosexuality. He was designed to be the Black Archie Bunker, a man whose bigotry and loud, domineering presence made his financial success less threatening to the conservative viewers of the era. Hemsley, a naturally quiet, introverted stage actor, was tasked with breathing life into this roaring cyclone of a character. He engineered the famous Jefferson strut, a chest-out, rapid-fire, aggressive walk that became a global cultural trademark. He weaponized his voice, maintaining a near-constant shout that commanded every room he entered. It was a masterclass in physical comedy and character acting. However, the immense immediate success of the character sealed Hemsley's fate. In 1975, CBS spun the character off into the Jeffersons, moving George and his wife Louise Wheezy Jefferson to a deluxe apartment in the sky. The show became a ratings juggernaut, generating staggering ad revenue and establishing itself as a pillar of American pop culture. But as the show's power grew, so did the network's desperate need to protect its investment. This is where the Hollywood public relations machinery took over, initiating a decades-long campaign of the straight illusion. In the 1970s and 1980s, the concept of an openly gay leading man starring in a family-oriented sitcom was not just controversial, it was considered an absolute impossibility. Network executives, advertisers, and studio publicists operated under the strict belief that the American public would instantaneously reject a show if the Patriarch was revealed to be a homosexual. The financial stakes were simply too high to allow for authenticity. Therefore, a secondary script was written for Sherman Hemsley, one he was required to perform off-camera. The studio's PR apparatus carefully curated his public image. Interviews with magazines like Jet, Ebony, and TV Guide were heavily vetted and tightly controlled. The narrative fed to the public focused exclusively on his comedic genius, his rags-to-riches background in Philadelphia, and his on-screen chemistry with his co-star, Isabel Sanford. When it came to his personal life, a deliberate, sanitized void was created. In Hollywood, when a high-profile actor lacks a visible romantic life, the PR machine often steps in to manufacture one. While Hemsley fiercely resisted the most overt forms of fake Hollywood dating, he was nevertheless required to play the game of respectability. Red carpet appearances and industry galas required him to be flanked by female companions, often castmates, publicists, or trusted friends who served the dual purpose of providing a respectable visual while acting as a buffer against probing journalists. This was a standard, unspoken industry practice of the era, widely recognized by insiders, but invisible to the viewing public. This enforced illusion was not merely a matter of studio preference. It was codified into the legal reality of the entertainment business. Hemsley, like almost all television stars of his generation, was bound by the standard morality clause, embedded in his studio contracts. These clauses, a remnant of the old studio system, granted the network the absolute right to terminate an actor's contract immediately if they engaged in conduct that brought them into public disrepute, contempt, scandal, or ridicule, or that shocked, insulted, or offended the community. In the legal and cultural framework of the 1970s and early 1980s, homosexuality was routinely classified under this umbrella of moral turpitude. Hemsley was not hiding his sexuality simply because he was a private person. He was hiding it under the constant looming threat of contractual termination, financial ruin, and industry blacklisting. If a tabloid had published definitive proof of his lifestyle, CBS would have had the legal ammunition to fire him the next day, effectively killing the Jeffersons and putting hundreds of crew members out of work. He carried the economic weight of an entire production on the condition of his silence. The psychological dissonance required to maintain this dual life was staggering. Every day, Hemsley drove to the CBS lot, stepped out of his quiet reality, and put on the heavy armor of George Jefferson. He was required to shout, to dominate, and often to deliver lines that leaned heavily into homophobic tropes. Writers frequently used the character's aggressive masculinity as a vehicle for cheap jokes about effeminate men or the LGBT community. Hemsley, a gay man, was contractually obligated to stand under hot studio lights and deliver these punchlines to a live studio audience, actively participating in the marginalization of his own hidden demographic. Those who worked behind the scenes noted the jarring contrast. When the director called "cut," the loud, abrasive Patriarch vanished. Hemsley would quietly retreat to his dressing room, often burying himself in books or listening to his beloved progressive rock music through headphones. He was polite, reserved, and almost entirely isolated from the typical Hollywood social scene. He was a ghost haunting his own television show. This transactional relationship between the actor and the corporate machinery continued for 11 record-breaking seasons. Hemsley delivered his end of the bargain flawlessly. He generated millions of dollars, secured massive syndication deals for the network, and cemented his place in television history without ever causing a scandal. But the Hollywood machinery is entirely devoid of loyalty. It views actors not as human beings, but as depreciating assets. In 1985, after 253 episodes, the Jeffersons began to show a natural decline in ratings, dipping to the 59th spot out of 96 programs. Without warning, CBS brought the axe down. The cancellation was an execution devoid of any sentimentality. There was no grand series finale written to give the characters closure. There was no farewell press tour. There was no wrap party to honor a cast and crew that had worked together for over a decade. In a display of profound corporate disrespect, the network executives did not even bother to make a phone call to the show's leading star, Sherman Hemsley, the man who had sacrificed his authentic identity to build a television empire for CBS, discovered he was unemployed when he casually opened a newspaper and read the entertainment section. His co-star, Isabel Sanford, would later publicly express her disgust, labeling the network's actions as a completely disrespectful betrayal. It was a cold, clarifying moment that exposed the grim reality of the industry's power dynamics. Hemsley had played their game perfectly. He had played the exact part they demanded flawlessly, never breaking character in the public eye. He had kept the secrets they required, but the moment his commercial utility expired, the straight illusion was no longer needed, and the Patriarch was unceremoniously discarded onto the street. The machinery had extracted everything it needed, leaving Hemsley to navigate the aftermath of a life lived entirely in the shadows. When the red light on the CBS studio cameras flicked off, Sherman Hemsley did not simply commute home, he transitioned between two entirely hostile realities. The moment he stepped out of the George Jefferson wardrobe, he entered a state of hypervigilance that would define his existence for over 3 decades. Examining the private life of a closeted television icon in the 1970s and 1980s reveals an architecture of extreme paranoia. Hemsley was not merely keeping a secret. He was operating with a relentless, exhausting vigilance, calculating every move to protect his career and personal safety from public exposure and ruin. The threat landscape he navigated was relentless. The late 1970s and the 1980s marked the explosion of the modern tabloid industry. Publications like the National Enquirer and the Globe were transitioning from peripheral gossip sheets into massively funded, aggressive corporate entities. They deployed armies of private investigators, paid exorbitant bounties to hotel staff, chauffeurs, and disgruntled former employees, and utilized early long-lens photography to dismantle the PR manufactured facades of Hollywood royalty. The commodification of celebrity scandal had become a billion-dollar industry, and the ultimate prize, the most lucrative headline a tabloid could print during this era, was the forcible outing of a supposedly heterosexual leading man. For Hemsley, the stakes were exponentially higher than those of his white contemporaries. He was navigating a brutal intersection of race, class, and sexuality. The underground gay ecosystem of Los Angeles during his peak fame was heavily segregated. The burgeoning gay liberation movement centered in West Hollywood was overwhelmingly white, highly visible, and culturally disconnected from the reality of black performers. For a black man, stepping into the white-dominated LGBT spaces of Los Angeles meant facing a different brand of alienation and racism. Conversely, within the black community, the conservative influence of the church and the rigid tenets of respectability politics rendered homosexuality an absolute taboo. Hemsley was trapped in a demographic no man's land. He was too famous to blend into the gay underground, too black to find sanctuary in the mainstream LGBT movement, and too gay to be his authentic self within the community that idolized his television persona. Therefore, he had to build his own ecosystem. This required a profound level of calculated isolation. Hemsley's personal residence was essentially a fortress, designed to keep the world out rather than invite it in. While his television contemporaries were purchasing sprawling, highly visible estates in Beverly Hills and hosting lavish industry parties to climb the Hollywood social ladder, Hemsley retreated inward. He heavily restricted access to his inner sanctum. His personal staff was kept to an absolute minimum, composed only of individuals whose loyalty had been tested and verified over years. Every new person introduced into his orbit, every driver, every housekeeper, every personal assistant, was a potential liability, a possible informant who could trade his reality for a tabloid payday. The psychological burden of looking into the eyes of everyone you meet and calculating their capacity for betrayal is a specific type of trauma. It breeds a profound, chilling loneliness. Within the walls of his fortress, Hemsley constructed an alternative identity that served as both a genuine passion and a flawless decoy. He cultivated the persona of the eccentric, aging hippie. This was not entirely an act. He genuinely despised the superficiality of Hollywood. But the hippie persona provided a highly effective, socially acceptable shield. If he was perceived as an eccentric loner obsessed with counterculture, people were less likely to probe the deeper, more dangerous truth of his sexuality. The core of this alternative identity was his obsessive dedication to progressive rock music. While George Jefferson was deeply embedded in the aesthetics of Black American success, Sherman Hemsley spent his private hours consuming the complex, experimental, and heavily European sounds of bands like Yes, Gentle Giant, and Gong. He transformed areas of his home into high-end audio sanctuaries. Music was his anesthesia, progressive rock with its intricate time signatures, sprawling instrumental narratives, and complete detachment from traditional pop structures offered a total intellectual escape from the rigid, laugh-track-driven formula of the three-camera sitcom. When he was enveloped in the sound of a 20-minute Moog synthesizer solo, he did not have to be a trailblazing black actor, and he did not have to be a closeted gay man. He was simply a listener, safely insulated from the demands of his physical reality. However, total isolation is unsustainable. Like anyone else, Hemsley required human connection, intimacy, and community. Accessing these basic human needs required navigating a high-stakes underground labyrinth. The black gay underground of the 1970s and 1980s did not operate in brightly lit nightclubs on main boulevards. It existed in the shadows, in discreet, unmarked bars, private after-hours clubs, and heavily vetted house parties often referred to as the Chitlin circuit of the LGBT scene. To enter this world, one had to know the geography, understand the coded language, and be vouched for by an insider. It was within this subterranean network that Hemsley occasionally allowed himself to exist. Industry insiders and close associates from that era have noted that he was not entirely a hermit. He quietly navigated these spaces, often accompanied by a very tight, heavily trusted inner circle. Fellow actors who shared his predicament, such as certain co-stars who later spoke vaguely of their shared experiences, formed a silent brotherhood. They acted as a mutual protection racket. They would coordinate their movements, scope out venues for potential media threats or extortionists, and provide alibis for one another. When Hemsley did socialize in these underground spaces, the protocol was strict. He avoided areas where cameras were present. He maintained a low profile, utilizing the back entrances of venues and avoiding the VIP sections that drew attention. He was constantly scanning the room, engaging in a continuous calculus of risk. A single photograph taken by a patron with a pocket camera could end his career. The anxiety of this surveillance was suffocating. He could never fully relax. The shadow of George Jefferson was always standing right behind him. This reality birthed the glass closet of Black Hollywood, an open secret universally understood by the industry elite, but fiercely protected from the public. Studio executives, producers, and castmates were largely aware of Hemsley's sexuality. They recognized the trusted male companions who quietly accompanied him to sets or waited in his dressing room, men who were officially credentialed under the vague catch-all title of personal assistant or manager. But the system protected him, not out of progressive empathy, but out of cold capitalistic self-interest. As long as Hemsley maintained plausible deniability, as long as he never forced the network to publicly acknowledge his sexuality, CBS would shield him. They would ensure publicists killed dangerous rumors, and they would provide the necessary female dates for public industry events to maintain the visual illusion of heterosexuality. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as a professional relationship. The network held the gun of termination to his career, and Hemsley paid his ransom every single day by remaining silent. The psychological toll of maintaining this infrastructure of paranoia was immense. It requires a staggering amount of cognitive energy to constantly monitor your own speech, adjust your physical mannerisms, vet your social circle, and suppress your natural instincts for decades. Hemsley could never slip. A careless comment, a lingering glance in the wrong direction at a public event, or a failure to properly disguise a romantic relationship could trigger the destruction of the empire he built. Many industry insiders suggest that this relentless pressure forged the intense, almost clinical discipline that defined his later years. He could not afford the reckless abandon that characterized many of his Hollywood peers. While other stars succumbed to the highly public, destructive vices of the era, Hemsley's survival depended on total control. He had to be smarter, quieter, and more disciplined than everyone else in the room. He survived the Hollywood machine not by fighting it, but by outmaneuvering it in the dark, building a fortress of eccentricity and silence that no tabloid could breach. But a fortress, no matter how well constructed, is ultimately just a prison you build for yourself. To comprehend the full scope of Sherman Hemsley's reality, one must strip away the gloss of celebrity and examine the cold, mechanical power dynamics of the 1970s and 1980s television industry. Hollywood during this era was not a progressive collective. It was an oligarchy. 3 major broadcast networks controlled nearly 100% of the American television audience. Among them, CBS was known as the Tiffany Network, an undeniable corporate monolith. When you worked for CBS, you did not simply have a job, you existed within their sovereign territory. The power imbalance between the network executives who occupied the corner offices and the talent operating on the sound stages was absolute. Hemsley was caught in a trap that was simultaneously lucrative and entirely suffocating. The primary weapon in the network's arsenal was the standard talent contract. In the modern era, high-profile actors often secure producing credits, back-end points, and creative control. In Hemsley's era, particularly for black actors, these concessions were virtually non-existent. Despite being the face of a show that anchored the network's comedy block and generated staggering syndication revenues, Hemsley was legally classified as an employee, not a partner. He did not own the character of George Jefferson. He did not own a percentage of the intellectual property. His financial security was entirely dependent on a weekly episodic salary, leaving him uniquely vulnerable to corporate extortion. Embedded within these ironclad contracts was the morals clause. Originally developed in the 1920s to protect studio investments from public scandals, by the 1980s this legal mechanism had been quietly weaponized against the LGBT community in Hollywood. The language was deliberately vague, granting the network the unilateral right to terminate an actor who engaged in behavior that offended public decency or brought the network into disrepute. In the conservative, heavily religious socio-political climate of the Reagan era, homosexuality was the ultimate violation of this clause. Network executives did not need to actively threaten Hemsley. The threat was ambient, permanent, and understood by everyone in the industry. It was a corporate Cold War. The executives knew about his lifestyle, the PR teams knew, and Hemsley knew they knew. This mutual understanding created a deeply toxic power dynamic. The network held the power to destroy his life overnight, to seize his income, and to trigger an avalanche of negative press that would permanently end his career. In exchange for their protection, Hemsley surrendered his autonomy. He became a high-value asset under strict corporate management. This grip extended directly to the creative process. The character of George Jefferson was a specific commodity. He was designed to be abrasive, prejudiced, and aggressively masculine. But the words coming out of Hemsley's mouth were rarely his own. The writers' rooms for major sitcoms during this period were overwhelmingly, often exclusively, white and heterosexual. They were tasked with writing a black patriarch, and they heavily relied on broad, sometimes offensive stereotypes to generate easy laughs from a mainstream audience. For Hemsley, the psychological friction of this setup was severe. He was frequently handed scripts that required him to deliver aggressive rants, some of which contained implicit or explicit homophobic undertones. The character of George Jefferson was structured to be intolerant. For a closeted gay man standing on a stage, hitting his marks, and aggressively performing bigotry against his own community was an act of profound psychological endurance. If a white heterosexual leading man objected to a script, it was considered an assertion of creative vision. If Hemsley, a black actor carrying a massive production, objected too strongly, he risked being labeled difficult, a dangerous designation that executives used to justify replacing or silencing talent. He possessed no creative veto power. He was an incredibly highly paid pawn. His job was to execute the material, generate the ratings, and remain completely silent about his personal discomfort. Furthermore, the system's grip was reinforced by the external socio-political climate of the 1980s. The rise of the moral majority and the increasing political power of conservative religious groups meant that television was viewed as the front line in a cultural war for American values. Advertisers were terrified of boycotts. If a sponsor caught wind of a potential scandal, they would pull their funding instantaneously. The networks, operating entirely on ad revenue, were hypersensitive to this threat. Hemsley was therefore heavily monitored by a shadow network of industry publicists and fixers. These were professionals employed by the studios or high-end PR firms to manage crises before they exploded. Their job was to cultivate relationships with tabloid editors, hotel managers, and police departments to ensure that any inconvenient incidents involving their high-value stars were quietly suppressed. This practice, often involving the exchange of exclusive interviews or access in return for killing a story, meant that Hemsley's private life was constantly being brokered behind closed doors. He was a piece of leverage in a much larger corporate game. The pressure from within the black community also acted as a powerful locking mechanism. The Jeffersons was not just a television show. For many black Americans, it was a vital piece of representation. George and Louise Jefferson represented financial independence, upward mobility, and the dismantling of the subservient television tropes of the past. The community fiercely protected the image of this strong, uncompromising black family. Hemsley understood the sociological weight he carried. If his sexuality had been exposed, the backlash from the conservative factions within the black church and the broader public would have been swift and punitive. He would not just be viewed as a man who lost his job. He would be framed as a man who betrayed the community's image of respectable progress. The intersection of racial expectations and corporate control created an inescapable vice. As the years ground on, the power dynamics began to shift, but never in Hemsley's favor. The network continuously squeezed the property for every available dollar. They expanded the episode orders, demanding grueling production schedules. They syndicated the show, airing reruns multiple times a day across the country, generating billions in ad revenue over the decades, wealth that Hemsley, lacking back-end ownership, only saw a fraction of. The executives viewed him as a highly efficient machine. As long as the machine produced the required output, the loud voice, the aggressive strut, the high ratings, they did not care about the internal wear and tear. They demanded that he compartmentalize his humanity entirely. He was not permitted to have a public breakdown, a controversial political opinion, or a visible romantic partner. He was required to exist in a state of suspended animation, frozen in the amber of his television persona, permanently serving the financial interests of the men who controlled his contract. This is the grim reality of the Hollywood machinery during its peak network era. It did not merely employ actors, it consumed them. Sherman Hemsley negotiated a ceasefire with this system. He agreed to the terms of his own erasure. He built the wealth of others, protected the jobs of his crew, and maintained his status as an icon. But the cost of doing business was the total surrender of his authentic life to the corporate ledger. The human body is not engineered to sustain a permanent state of high-alert deception. Psychologists and medical researchers document that living a deeply closeted existence triggers a chronic, low-grade fight-or-flight response. The constant monitoring of one's own behavior, the suppression of natural instincts, and the persistent terror of discovery generate continuous spikes in cortisol. Over decades, this invisible psychological friction inevitably manifests as profound physical and emotional exhaustion. For Sherman Hemsley, the toll was compounded by the physical demands of his specific brand of performance. Acting is not merely reciting lines, it is a full-body athletic undertaking. For 11 years on The Jeffersons, Hemsley did not just play a character, he functioned as a human pressure cooker. George Jefferson operated at maximum volume. He yelled, he berated, he stomped, and he physically dominated the soundstage. Hemsley, a naturally soft-spoken and physically slight man, had to artificially generate this explosive aggression every single day. The vocal cord strain alone from maintaining that trademark abrasive shout for over 250 episodes was severe. But the true exhaustion was entirely internal. When the CBS cancellation hit in 1985, Hemsley was immediately confronted with a new, terrifying reality that went far beyond job security. The mid-1980s ushered in the darkest and most lethal chapter in the history of the LGBT community, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In the early 1980s, the disease was heavily stigmatized, initially labeled by the press and medical establishment as a gay-related immune deficiency. The societal response was not empathy, but severe moral panic and outright hostility. Politicians ignored the crisis. Conservative commentators framed the disease as divine retribution, and the mainstream media sensationalized the suffering of the afflicted. For an openly gay man, the disease was a death sentence. For a closeted gay public figure, it was a dual execution. If a high-profile actor contracted the virus, they faced physical death preceded immediately by the public, irreversible destruction of their career and legacy. The 1985 death of Hollywood leading man Rock Hudson from AIDS-related complications shattered the industry. Hudson's deeply guarded secret was violently exposed by his diagnosis. The tabloid press turned his final days into a grotesque public spectacle. This event sent a shockwave of sheer terror through the underground networks of Los Angeles. The message was clear. Biology could now out you when the paparazzi could not. For Hemsley, the parameters of his paranoia shifted. The threat was no longer just a telephoto lens or a disgruntled assistant. The threat was microscopic. The underground ecosystem he occasionally navigated became a landscape of extreme anxiety. Men in his wider circles began to quietly disappear, their deaths often obscured by families and publicists citing pneumonia or cancer to protect their post-mortem reputations. The psychological weight of watching peers die while simultaneously being unable to publicly mourn them or support the community due to the risk of exposure, created a profound moral injury. Hemsley was forced to watch a plague devastate his demographic while remaining completely silent, maintaining the aggressive heterosexual bravado that the public demanded of him. In the face of this immense pressure, many Hollywood figures turned to the easily accessible anesthesias of the era: cocaine, heroin, and heavy alcohol abuse. These substances offered rapid, chemically induced numbness to the trauma of the closet and the terror of the epidemic. Hemsley, however, chose a radically different coping mechanism. He recognized that substance abuse led to a loss of control, and loss of control inevitably led to exposure. His anesthesia was discipline. Instead of self-destruction, Hemsley hyperfixated on the exact opposite: absolute biological control. He adopted an intensely strict lifestyle. He quit smoking entirely, a habit he had picked up in his youth. He transitioned to a heavily organic diet long before it became a mainstream cultural trend. He routinely engaged in strict fasting to detoxify his system. On the surface, this appeared to be the routine of a health-conscious actor. In reality, it was a desperate psychological bid for agency. The entertainment industry controlled his public identity, his schedule, and his income. Society controlled where he could safely exist. The only territory Sherman Hemsley had absolute, unquestioned sovereignty over was his own physical body. By exerting militant control over what he consumed and how he maintained his health, he built an internal fortress. It was a coping mechanism designed to keep him grounded when the external world was defined by deception and disease. His professional choices during this era also reflected a grim, pragmatic survival instinct. Immediately following the demise of the Jeffersons, Hemsley signed on to star in the NBC sitcom Amen, which premiered in 1986. If the Jeffersons was a gilded cage, Amen was a different wing of the same prison. Hemsley was cast as Deacon Ernest Fry, the head of the board at the First Community Church of Philadelphia. Once again, he was tasked with playing a loud, arrogant, and aggressive patriarch. but this role carried a heavier layer of bitter irony. Hemsley was now the star of a sitcom centered entirely around the Black Protestant Church. This was the exact institution that served as the moral authority for millions of Black Americans, and the exact institution that most aggressively condemned his actual existence. On stage, he delivered lines invoking scripture, playing a community moral leader. Offstage, he knew that the demographic tuning in every week to laugh at his antics would likely demand his immediate excommunication and industry blacklisting if they knew the truth about his personal life. He spent 5 years on Amen, generating another 110 episodes of television, cementing his legacy and burying his reality even deeper. As the 1990s approached, the cumulative toll of this dual existence prompted the final phase of his anesthesia: total geographic and social withdrawal. Hemsley realized that as long as he remained in the coastal hubs of Los Angeles or New York, he would never be free of the surveillance apparatus. He despised the obligatory industry functions, the false smiles on the red carpets, and the constant low-level hum of anxiety that permeated Hollywood. He decided to sever his ties with the epicenter of American media. He packed up his life and relocated to El Paso, Texas. This was not a standard retirement destination for a wealthy television icon. It was a deliberate, strategic retreat. El Paso, nestled against the Mexican border and surrounded by vast stretches of the Chihuahuan Desert, offered extreme physical isolation. It was a blue-collar, quiet city, entirely disconnected from the entertainment industry's power centers. The paparazzi did not operate in El Paso. The network executives did not socialize in El Paso. In the desert, Hemsley finally constructed the life he had been denied for decades. He purchased a modest home. He largely abandoned the George Jefferson persona, adopting the quiet, unassuming lifestyle he had always preferred. He spent his days deep diving into his progressive rock and jazz fusion collections. He built a small, highly insulated, chosen family, settling into a quiet domestic routine with his trusted manager, Flora Inchinton Bernal, and his close companion, Kenny Johnston. Many close to him noted that the El Paso years were the first time the actor appeared genuinely relaxed. He had successfully outrun the machine. He occasionally accepted minor voiceover work or brief guest appearances, such as his cameos on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, strictly to maintain his union health insurance and a baseline of financial liquidity. But he refused to re-enter the Hollywood ecosystem in any meaningful way. He had spent over 2 decades acting as the loud, brash, aggressively straight patriarch of Black America. He had survived the bigotry of the 1970s, the brutal corporate leverage of network television, and the terrifying silent plague of the 1980s. But survival had required the total sacrifice of his authentic public self. By retreating to the Texas desert, Sherman Hemsley administered his final dose of anesthesia. He chose the quiet obscurity of the borderlands because it was the only place where the world finally stopped demanding him to be someone else. The geography of El Paso provided Sherman Hemsley with a crucial buffer against the surveillance of Hollywood, but it offered no protection against the mechanics of human biology. Despite decades of rigid dietary discipline, meticulous fasting, and an almost militant control over his physical environment, his body began to fail. In the early summer of 2012, the lingering consequences of a smoking habit he had abandoned in his youth finally materialized. Hemsley was diagnosed with a severe and aggressive form of lung cancer. The biological reality of the disease was brutal and rapid. The tumor caused a condition known as superior vena cava syndrome. This occurs when the major vein carrying blood from the upper half of the body to the heart becomes severely compressed or obstructed. The physical symptoms are distressing swelling of the face and neck, severe shortness of breath, and a rapidly deteriorating physical state. Confronted with this diagnosis, Hemsley made a clinical autonomous decision. He was presented with the standard aggressive treatment protocols, heavy chemotherapy and radiation. He refused both. Having spent the vast majority of his adult life fighting to maintain control over his own existence against the demands of network executives and the expectations of society, he was not willing to surrender his final days to the toxic, debilitating effects of chemical treatments. He opted for palliative care. He chose to die on his own terms within the walls of his El Paso sanctuary, surrounded exclusively by the people he had hand-selected to be his family. On June 13, 2012, knowing his time was extremely limited and possessing full mental capacity, Hemsley executed his final will and testament. The document was straightforward, legally binding, and deeply revealing. He named his longtime manager, Flora Enchinton Bernal, as the sole beneficiary and executor of his estate. He legally entrusted her with his assets and the authority to manage his final arrangements. For Hemsley, a man entirely estranged from his biological family and the Hollywood ecosystem, Enchinton and his close friend Kenny Johnston were his legitimate family. On July 24, 2012, Sherman Hemsley died quietly at his home. He was 74 years old. The immediate aftermath of his death should have been a quiet, dignified military burial at Fort Bliss, as he had requested. Instead, his passing triggered a grotesque and protracted legal hostage crisis. The moment the news of his death hit the national wires, the vultures descended, exposing the fundamental vulnerability of the LGBTQ plus chosen family within the American legal system. The primary instigator of this crisis was a man named Richard Thornton, a resident of Philadelphia. Thornton emerged immediately following the publication of Hemsley's death, armed with a DNA test indicating a high probability that he was Hemsley's half-brother, the product of the father. Hemsley did not even meet until he was 14 years old. Thornton filed an immediate emergency injunction in the Texas probate courts to block the execution of Hemsley's will, contest the validity of the document, and seize control of the body. Shortly after, a second individual, Reverend Michael Wells, claiming to be a cousin, also filed legal motions attempting to secure a piece of the estate. The legal basis of Thornton's challenge rested on the allegation that the will was executed under undue influence, and that Hemsley was not of sound mind during his final weeks. This is a standard, highly aggressive legal tactic routinely weaponized against the chosen families of deceased individuals, particularly within the LGBTQ plus community. When a closeted or intensely private person dies leaving their assets to a companion or manager rather than biological relatives, estranged blood relatives frequently utilize the probate courts to invalidate those relationships. The legal system inherently privileges biological ties over the complex, deeply personal bonds formed by marginalized individuals seeking safety. The most shocking aspect of this legal assault was the sheer financial reality of the estate being contested. When the probate documents were filed, the total estimated value of Sherman Hemsley's estate was roughly $50,000. This number stands as a damning indictment of the Hollywood machinery of the 1970s and 1980s. Sherman Hemsley was the anchor of a television show that ran for 11 seasons, comprising 253 episodes. The Jeffersons generated hundreds of millions of dollars in primary advertising revenue for CBS and went on to generate incalculable wealth in global syndication for decades. Yet, due to the predatory nature of standard network contracts of that era, which denied black actors producing credits, back-end profit participation, or ownership of their characters, the man who built the empire died with the net worth of an entry-level postal worker. However, for the estranged relatives, the battle was not merely about the $50,000. It was about the control of a lucrative legacy, the potential rights to his name and likeness, and the authority to shape his historical narrative. The immediate horrifying consequence of this legal injunction fell upon Hemsley's physical remains, because the jurisdiction over the body was actively disputed in a court of law. The San Jose Funeral Home in El Paso was legally barred from burying the actor, cremating him, or releasing him to his chosen family. For 3.5 months, the body of one of the most significant cultural icons in American television history was wrapped, tagged, and placed on a shelf inside a refrigerated unit at a local morgue. As summer turned into autumn, the man who had electrified Broadway, shattered television ratings, and navigated the treacherous waters of respectability politics lay completely abandoned in a freezer. It was the ultimate tragic contradiction. Hemsley had spent his entire life carefully guarding his autonomy and his privacy. In death, he was stripped of all agency, held as a literal hostage in a bizarre legal standoff, initiated by individuals he had purposefully excluded from his life. The trial took place in the El Paso County Probate Court under Judge Patricia Chu. It was a humiliating public dissection of Hemsley's private life. Flora Enchinton Bernal was forced to take the stand and defend her decades-long relationship with a man who trusted her implicitly. She testified to the reality of his isolation from his biological family, stating unequivocally on the record that in their 20 years of close association, Hemsley never once mentioned Richard Thornton or Michael Wells. He had no relationship with them. He had built his own family, and now that family was being forced to justify its existence to a judge. The media coverage of this period was highly sanitized and sensationalized. The tabloids focused on the macabre angle of the TV legend in a freezer, treating it as a bizarre true crime oddity. Mainstream obituaries lauded his comedic timing and his groundbreaking representation of black wealth on television. But the media systematically erased the underlying subtext of the legal battle. They refused to contextualize the probate fight within the broader history of closeted public figures whose final wishes are routinely trampled by biological families, seeking to erase their non-traditional lives. Even in death, the straight illusion of George Jefferson was protected, while the actual reality of Sherman Hemsley's vulnerability was ignored. Finally, on November 9, 2012, after 109 days of legal maneuvering, the court reached a verdict. Judge Chu ruled that the will executed on June 13th was entirely valid. She dismissed the claims of undue influence and recognized Flora Inchinton Bernal as the sole legal executor of the estate. The legal system had technically worked, but the damage was irreversible. The injunction was lifted. The funeral home was authorized to release the body. The hostage crisis was over, but the final silent lie had already been permanently cemented into the public record. Hemsley's life had been reduced to a probate file, his massive contributions to culture overshadowed by the sheer indignity of his delayed rest. The machinery had finished its work. On November 21st, 2012, Sherman Hemsley was finally buried. The ceremony took place at Fort Bliss National Cemetery in Texas, complete with military honors reflecting his service in the Air Force. The attendance was sparse. Approximately 150 people gathered in the desert to mark the end of his life. The media immediately noticed a glaring void at the funeral, the almost total absence of his former television family. Tabloids and online commentators quickly circulated rumors of a cold-hearted boycott by the cast of The Jeffersons. They speculated that his co-stars had turned their backs on him in death. The factual reality was far less dramatic and entirely rooted in the timeline of the legal hostage crisis. The 3.5-month delay in securing his burial had a severe logistical cost. By the time the probate court released his body in late November, the surviving cast members were limited by age and health. Marla Gibbs, who played the iconic maid Florence Johnston, was 81 years old and physically unable to make the sudden trip to West Texas. The rest of his core on-screen family, Isabel Sanford, Roxy Roker, Franklin Cover, and Mike Evans, had all passed away years prior. The empty chairs at Fort Bliss were not a statement of disrespect. They were the direct collateral damage of the probate battle that kept him in a freezer until his peers could no longer attend. Hemsley left behind a massive cultural footprint. His work on television secured Emmy and Golden Globe nominations, generated billions in syndication revenue, and permanently altered the landscape of American broadcast comedy. He proved that a sitcom centered on a wealthy, uncompromising black family could dominate network ratings. Yet the legacy officially recorded by the entertainment industry is incomplete. It is a highly sanitized, commercially safe fragment of his actual existence. The historical record vigorously celebrates the loud, aggressively heterosexual bravado of George Jefferson. It actively ignores the quiet, disciplined, closeted gay man who engineered that performance. This was the ultimate cost of his survival. The industry demanded absolute conformity, and society's escalating fears only locked him further into silence. Hemsley navigated this hostile environment with cold, pragmatic discipline. He understood the terms of his employment. He was allowed to be a trailblazer, provided he never revealed who he actually was. He honored that brutal contract until his final day. He traded his personal authenticity for the financial security of his crew and his own survival. In an industry that viewed him as a highly profitable commodity rather than a human being, Sherman Hemsley gave the American public its most confident, unyielding television patriarch. He made the country laugh for a decade. In exchange, the system required him to spend a lifetime hiding, ensuring that the man who demanded respect in millions of living rooms was never granted the basic dignity of living his own truth